How's it going, everyone? So in this video I basically want to continue with that kind of 90s UK organ house style. In this one I'm essentially going to be referencing probably one of the most popular tracks of the last 4 months, which finally got released like just last week, which is Luke Dean's Get Hard You in the Lobby. So it's a really cool track with like loads of interesting sounds and techniques, and I basically thought I would attempt to break down everything about it and kind of dive into what makes it such a banger. So this is what the track remix is going to sound like. As a reminder, if you want the project file, you can get that from our Patreon, where you can basically get full project as I've recreated it with additional elements. And you can also get like our kind of preview organ sample pack, which I'm working on, and I've uploaded like 100 different organ samples for that. So yeah, without further ado, let's just get straight into it. The first thing is the vocals. So the very first vocal I have isn't actually in the track, but the first time I heard the track was at a set, the Rossi and Josh Baker set in Synthy Festival. They basically mixed the Luke Dean track in with that vocal. So the vocal is this. Let me show you love. It's Romantony, Let Me Show You Love, this song here. Let me show you love. So I basically couldn't find that vocal online, but I found the track, and something you can do these days is use like AI stem separation tools. They've come on a long way since like I first started making music, where you basically just had to hope there was a version that was clean enough online. You get fairly mixed results, but a tool I like to use, there's plenty of them, is called vocalremover.org. And there's another one called like LAI.ai or something. It's like LALALA, something weird, but it's like a paid service and it splits into 4 different stems. And I basically encourage you to kind of look into these tools, but I basically use this one, which splits it into music and vocal. So it probably works about 80% of the time, this tool, and there's loads of them out there. So this is what I use to create like DIY acapellas, and I basically just get pretty clean vocal. Let me show you love. You know it's good if you don't even have processing on and you can hear it very cleanly. So I basically got this vocal here, almost simulating that kind of set I watched. Let me show you love. So that's the first vocal. Essentially, the track is split into 3 layers. You have the You in the Lobby vocal, you have the kind of Get Hard ad-lib, and then you have the kind of vocal which is like automatic. So basically what I've done for the You in the Lobby one, because it's quite a niche saying, is I've taken or attempted to do a DIY version using that same software. And you'll hear there's like artifacts from the kind of original. So it's basically picked up artifacts from the kind of distortion, saturation effects, and the kind of stabs. So it's not a perfect tool. So essentially you've got the You in the Lobby, and I've kept it in there like I talked about in the last video. Essentially you want to basically just find these like phrases, like ad-libs, and you can get as creative as you want. This sounds, I couldn't pinpoint the exact like location, but it's definitely sampled from somewhere in the UK, and it's some girl saying You in the Lobby in like a really distinct accent. I actually attempted to record my own version. If you want to hear me embarrass myself, it will be available within the kind of right there. if you just go to record it, you'll hear my version. I'll not spoil the secret. So essentially just finding a random phrase. Like, there's not really any one size fits all when it comes to this. He's got you in the lobby, and then we've got the get hard.
You've got a sick mind!
It's basically like percussive vocals. I also talked about this, like texture vocals in the last one. Like if you have really short notes and you set it to gate mode, you can basically create these like really percussive vocals which work really well. And he's basically just like used it as like a almost like a percussion. So I've got different colors for kind of the different parts, but it's basically experimentation throughout. The longer notes are like the full phrase. So different variations. For this one, it's like a build up. So basically just taking phrases and creating really rhythmic, percussive kind of textures to them. I always like to mention basically how you can maybe like source vocals similar to this, and I did like quite a long segment on it in the last video, but if you're looking for like specific phrases, it's probably not rocket science to most people, but I might as well let's say it. Like you can basically type in different phrases, like you might use splice, or you can even just like search your own library. So I think I just ended up searching like get. I basically just got a bunch of ad-libs. Basically a bunch of ad-libs that I've sliced just to get that word, get. And now I've got this. So you can basically slice vocals and ad-libs, or you can simply just search the term.
Y'all ready to get funky?
So I've used the original just because it gives you a closer representation of the original, but you can get fairly creative. You can get fairly creative with like, I could swap this. So those are the experimentation you can do, but you can basically like search your library for vocals that use those specific phrases. And this kind of leads me on to the next part, which is the kind of automatic phrase. So for this, I searched my library and I couldn't find like any sample packs that utilize the phrase automatic. So what I essentially did was I found a bunch of phrases.
Automatic.
So that's the original.
Automatic.
You're automatically exempt.
Automatic.
And I basically basically just trim the word automatic. And I'm sure you'll be wondering where I found them. It's a site called getyarn.io, where you can basically just search for a phrase. So I've searched automatic here, and you're basically trying to find like words or phrases that are clean, because a lot of these are from like movies and TV shows.
Stick, that's automatic.
That's not automatic.
You can spend ages down these, and you can basically download them and they'll save as an MP4 and you can just drop them into your project. If we return to live, I basically gathered a bunch of these.
Automatic.
That's the one I just played.
Automatic.
That's like the females.
You're automatically exempt.
Automatic.
That's the one I ended up using, which annoyingly had like some artifacts in it, which is one of the things you have to be careful about this. So I've kind of like bandpassed it to make it more of a background noise.
Automatic.
And the DIY vocal didn't come out clean, so I had to trim the original.
It's automatic. Automatic.
So essentially you can get a bunch of like phrases, really specific phrases, that kind of saves you the hassle of having to skim through capellas for specific lyrics, if that's like what you want. And the kind of beauty of like finding multiple kind of phrases from different sources is you can kind of do the trick that he does in the original where he switches between. This kind of vocal there kind of helps to drive the track on. So that's essentially the vocals. Like, it's all really about kind of being clever with your sounds, and I really like the kind of ad-lib technique because you can just start jamming with different vocal syllables and get really creative. And the fact he's used like 3 different layers, kind of interchanging between one another, I think really kind of gives this track its own like unique feel. So the next part we move on to is going to be the drums, and there's not really much like variation when it comes to the drums. Like there's a lot of like similarities essentially, so probably go whiz over them again, and like always I'll touch on specific elements. So 4/4 kick, which sounds like this. So the majority of cases it's just a standard 4/4, and then you've obviously got like the kind of kick fill patterns where it's high passed. And you've got the kind of build section, which is pretty spot on his pattern. Not high passed in this case. So basically like placement of kicks can kind of add to the energy of the build up. So it's not just about the kind of 4/4, it's kind of about how you can make the overall arrangement pretty interesting by like just sporadically placing kicks. Just pick a nice sample and play around with the placement of like notes, especially in the kind of breakdown. Like I kind of talked about this kind of breakbeat style pattern in the last one. That kind of track utilized it a bit more. That's the kick. Then we have the claps and snares. This clap, just your classic, and then these kind of high like colored patterns of fills, and then this one below is like a main fill. So I basically just got that, and you've got like the kind of groove patterns here. Without it, it kind of becomes a bit repetitive very easily, but the danceability is kind of added when you do these kind of offbeat snares. Next up we have the hats. I've got this open hat. Very short but very sharp at the same time. Then I've layered it with this loop, which has a bit of reverb on it. But it's a really nice loop, which is typically your open hat, but it's got a few like kind of splash hats in there. So I basically added 2 hats which almost sound like they're going out of phase with one another, but it's helping to add a bit of grit that he's got in the mix. So this closed hat, kind of just a very short that which is driving it on. And you've got a shaker, which is kind of the one that's doing all the work. I've brought the sustain down on it using the waves smack attack because I don't want it really present. Then we have a crash, and then we just have like another crash effects. So that's essentially the hats. Last thing I always like to do is basically include a few loops. Got this one here, which kind of reminds me of like Michael Beebe, this kind of loop. Very groovy. So I've basically taken this kind of like top loop, no kick loop, and then just another loop after that, which I think like a very squeaky texture, where there's a filter on that's slowly moving, but apart from that, it's all just about, with the loops, finding something that kind of fills that void. That's essentially going to be the drums. Now is where we pretty much get to the more interesting stuff. So something he does, I believe, when I'm listening to it, is he's not got one bass. He's basically got kind of like one bass melody, which is split across loads of different parts. So as an example, he's essentially got this kind of subby kind of analog bass, but something he's done is basically taken the same pattern and split them across different layers. So just as the example, you'd probably have like a maybe like a sub, and then there's like an organ bass. There's one which is like a harmony, and then the same pattern with like variations is also included on the kind of organs as well. So it's like really interesting how he's basically made the same pattern interesting over like a number of different sounds. So for the first one, I've basically used an analog. So that's essentially just a sample I've taken from this file name. I think it's a sample CD. A lot of these kind of sample CDs, you can find long segments of audio which you can skim through. And I think I've basically just cropped it. I'll see if I can find it now actually. So you basically just get like the option to skim through different samples. And basically what I've done is cropped it, and the processing isn't anything special really, but the main thing is kind of like filtering it so it's not as clicky, because I don't really want that kind of high end. You're kind of like trying to make smart decisions with your mixing, so because this is kind of like a sub, I don't really want it taking up that high end. So I've got that. And what I've essentially done is I've got this kind of organ bass layered just for some like more texture in the low end. And then that kind of organ bass is also a sample, similar processing, just kind of filtered. Like I don't really like overthink the processing. Most of these chains you'll see are very similar. EQs, compression, and auto filter for the high end, and sidechain. Like there's loads of similarities with these chains. So I've basically got this chain here. And you'll just hear how it changes the vibe of the track when the different kind of layers are brought in. So this one, which is the subby analog layer. The stab is obviously coming from down there. You've got the organ kind of adding thickness. He's basically played around with different sounds which complement each other, but also played around with like the octave as well. A lot of these kind of secondary ones I've included are pitched up. But there's this kind of 7th bass here, then back to the main one. And then we've got so yeah, that's essentially the kind of like two basses. I've got this 7th harmony organ bass. Basically what it is it's an analog, pitched up an octave, but also with a 7th added. When I put it up 7, it's like a really common trick when you're like layering. And then I layered that even more. This one is quite high, it goes up 2 semitones, and I've basically just taken an organ sound. Basically this plugin here, if you're looking for like very raw 90s kind of old school hits, it's pretty cool for that. I basically just picked an organ sound from that and pitched it up 2 octaves. Layered it like that. So basically loads of different bass types and playing around with different sounds. As you'll see, they're all pretty much using the exact same pattern. That is essentially the bass. So the kind of iconic part of this style, which I touched on briefly in the last tutorial as well, is the kind of organ leads. A lot of these tracks utilize this kind of very ravey style organ, which isn't the kind of M1 that you normally associate with organ house. And I didn't really know what the source was last time around, but I actually came across a video which basically highlighted what that source was. So just before I introduce the source, this was the kind of lead. So I kind of showed the psychotropics kind of lead, which now I realize is basically a record which utilized it, but basically this kind of stab here, which was available in the Rave Generator synth. Basically the origin of it is the Casio CZ101 organ. So I found this video here, which I'll just kind of so it's got that really like distinct characteristic, and I haven't downloaded it myself, but I believe if you were to basically search Casio ZZ101 organ, you'd be able to find a bunch of samples. So essentially we've kind of repeated that kind of weird organ sound, and I believe I've actually utilized probably a similar source, but sample from Breakbeat Paradise organs, which sounds like this. What it basically is, as I kind of touched on, is pretty much this is like the main melody and everything else is more or less a variation. So for all those basses, you'll kind of see how they differ as I line them up. So the bass pattern is just go to the notes. So you'll see, I think I described it in a similar way before. You see they kind of, the patterns both follow one another, but then at certain times they go off and do their own thing. If we go to that pattern, I'll see if I can do both of them at the same time. Yep, we can show both of them. The orange is the bass. And you can get like really creative with this. So essentially, I think one of the things that makes this track is, like I was saying about how you're essentially splitting similar patterns up across different sounds, but you can't reuse the same pattern because otherwise the track will just get really messy. So I kind of kept that for just the bass, and then I probably would have started with this. So once you get that kind of organ sound, you can obviously play around with how long and short the note is, and you can get like really creative with effects and the like, but the kind of thing I think is the most important part about this, at least with this specific sound, is the kind of how you program the notes. So you basically want a combination of short and long notes. Because you don't want your whole pattern to be really like choppy, and you don't want it to be really long either. You want that kind of variation, but you also want the kind of organ, the kind of octave leaps. Which like really help this sound, like just to kind of bring this sound out. So that's kind of like the first organ, which is like this kind of lower organ. What I would have done next is I actually would have duplicated the layer and found a different sound, which was that kind of psychotropics kind of stab, which I personally think works a lot better at. Because this pattern's a lot like shorter. It's kind of that kind of stabbier pattern. So essentially you're trying to start with that kind of main organ, but you're also trying to add variation, which you could technically do within the same pattern. You could like pitch it up an octave in the notes, but you could equally have another layer, which allows you to kind of like process it differently and pitch it up an octave. The way this is kind of arranged as well is kind of similar to how the bass is. So if I just play all of it together, you'll just hear like how many different parts there are. We've got the octave up. That sound could be better, but back to the kind of the main bass, if you will. Then in the breakdown, got the kind of the full organ. Then we pitched it up for some kind of, it's almost like tension adding. Then we've got nothing. Then we're back to usual. Then we've got the high for some variation. So you can get very creative, like you can have the two complementary layers on top of one another, or you can have them playing different parts for some variation. There's just so much potential, and I think it's one of the things that this track's just done so well is picking the right sounds and just knowing how to switch things up to keep things interesting, essentially. So that's essentially the kind of organ part. The next kind of part we have is this part in the breakdown. It's kind of Q&A, and he actually has found a preset which allows him to kind of combine these two layers, but like there's not really any rules, like you can do whatever works. So I've essentially found this kind of sample, like this really kind of like resonant synth. And I've got a bit of LFO movement on it because I want it like kind of moving over time. So basically like a really nice acid pattern, like you can use an acid plugin or you can use like a textured synth. I've basically got that, and then what I've done is, because the sample isn't great at, or at least this specific sample isn't great at like emulating that kind of longer note pattern, I've basically just like duplicated it. Like I was saying, I've basically split it into two layers, but you could literally just have it in the one and find a preset which allows you to have those kind of shorter notes and then automate maybe it to make it a bit longer, or that kind of thing. So I basically just got two layers which are kind of processed similarly, but I kind of basically just doing the kind of Q and answer. So that's essentially the full kind of acid, if I just combine it, so those are essentially the acid lines. And then finally, we've just got like some additional extras really, like these aren't in the original, this is just me getting carried away. Essentially, what I like doing is like adding like Synthy textures. So I've talked about it in the last video and the Sweely textures one. Basically these kind of textures which act as transitions and could be like doubled up as SFX as well. So essentially taking like single notes like this, so sounds with like really nice textures. It's kind of hard to describe, but you'll hear them. This is a bass, and you can basically add arpeggiator to 16ths. And what I've done, pretty similar to last time, but I basically just added an LFO on triangle to basically sweep up the frequency, and it's kind of going like slanted, kind of uphill. It's like really glitchy. Got that, and I've got this sound here, which is pretty similar, just taken from a sample. So just ways you can add ear candy, like they're not always utilized in these tracks, but if you want to kind of make your transitions a lot smoother, you can add them. So I more or less just used them as kind of transitions really. So yeah, that's pretty much gonna be it for this one. I hope you've kind of found my attempt to break down Dean's track somewhat useful. Let us know in the comments if there's a particular track in this kind of general 90s organ house style that you want to see next, and let us know also if you have any questions. Do remember that if you want the project and the various kind of samples, including a lot of those like old school ones I mentioned, they'll all be linked below in the Patreon. And yeah, I'll see you in the next one.